Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon. Thank you for joining. My name is Varsha Ravichandran. I'm a junior sustainability consultant at Turner and Townsend. And today we are joined by David Arkell, Head of Housing Growth and Climate Amber Valley Borough Council. The purpose of today's event, this is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner and Townsend. This is going to be a short master class followed by plenty of opportunities for Q&A and followed by a poll at the end as well. So, a couple of housekeeping points before I hand it over to David. Please, I request everyone to keep your videos turned off and mics turned off before the Q&A session. And now I'm happy to hand it over to David to start the presentation.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. Good afternoon. So my name is Dave Arkell. I'm the Head of Housing, Growth and Climate at Amber Valley Borough Council. Amber Valley's, I'll just move on to the next slide. So in terms of what my talk today is, just to explain about where we are, go through a couple of projects, and I think the main focus really is very much to share with you the lessons learned and where we are and how we want to move forward. So if I move on to the next one, so Amber Valley Borough Council, for those that don't know, we're in sort of southeast Derbyshire, to the west of the M1, and basically very much between the Peak District and the sort of that main access from the M1. So we are, we're quite a big borough, around 126, 128,000 occupants. We have certainly the sort of older than the average housing types and age. We have sort of very few sort of large estates. We have a real sort of mix, and sort of one of the reasons I think we're here is that we recognise that with having likes of Derby and Nottingham and Sheffield and large urban areas near us, we really have to be quite competitive to try and secure sort of any kind of investment. So, and very much in terms of what I'm here to talk about today is the strength of how we've approached area-based work and how we worked collectively with partners. I think we've got some legitimacy in terms of us being here. We have the scheme, certainly one of them I'm going to talk to you about, has achieved a number of awards, and which has been, we're obviously very, very proud of, and has basically really generated a lot of interest. And the Borough Council was, I think, looking at some of the LAD 2, LAD 3 figures, we were in the top 5 nationally in terms of outputs that we achieved. So our first area project, we were, I'll just show you the pictures. This is Ironville. It's interestingly, it's quite a historical site. These were unusual in that these are 6 blocks of 16 terrace properties, and the sort of, we had originally tried and hoped to do something with in 1A. We just weren't ready. We put a speculative bid forward and got funding for 1B, and we were sort of naively thought we would be able to do 1 block of 16. It was very apparent to us that this was an area that very much needed a lift. Something like there was 96 houses in total, and we were estimating like 28, 29 had failed render. It was falling off. It looked really poor, and there was but one of the difficulties was this sort of community has lots of things have happened to it in the past, and there was sort of certainly some initial resistance. So what we aimed to do, so these houses had they were a very basic terrace property, and then they all got a modern addition that was actually that was a cavity wall where most of the houses had kitchen and bathroom. And interestingly, actually that was the sort of making those the back additions warm, and because they were back additions, historically couldn't have been done through other forms of funding. So yeah, that was our original aim, and ultimately we managed to get 68 out of the 96 completed, which at the time we were really quite pleased about. So in terms of set of lessons learned, if you obviously recall, in terms of one of the main challenges, COVID, there were deadlines, and one of the things that we were able to do, where LAD 2 was launched fairly soon after LAD 1B, and we were able to expand it quite rapidly and to be able to then offer it to all 96 properties. We very much work with our social housing provider. So we should say that the council isn't. The stock was transferred 20 years ago, so they were a really important part. And one of the things that we did really see was that the benefit of resident engagement and resident champions. That community, I think, were quite resistant to and couldn't believe, they didn't think it was true. So the very fact that we were offering a mixed tenure approach, that we had, we were off, and the social landlord, they were signed up, they were basically more than happy. Once those scaffoldings came up, actually people saw that it was really happening. But there was one person, we had a couple actually, one person in particular, a local shopkeeper, was really active and really encouraged residents and could see the benefit, and was really helpful in terms of getting things off the ground. And also we engaged with the local church. We found that one or two people just wouldn't engage, or they just didn't want to open the door for all sorts of reasons. So we basically we got them on board, explained what we were doing, and again, so local people basically encouraged people to take up. One thing I would like to also point out, perhaps looking at the pictures, this area is actually technically an IMD5, although nobody that knows that area would recognise it as such. It's just that where the lines are drawn, it happens to be near some quite more affluent areas, and therefore it has affected. So I have got some concerns going forward around warm homes and this sort of, I would like to see some sort of more flexibility about how we can approach addressing areas that really need it. Nobody in the locality sort of questioned why we were doing the work there. So I think importantly, from our perspective, if you're going to do an area-based scheme, we found some really serious issues internally that perhaps we don't need too much explanation, but perhaps leave people living in fair degrees of squalor, and we just couldn't ignore that. And inevitably, some of the houses needed more than just external wall insulation or cavity wall insulation and loft. So we looked at other funding sources and were able to help. Managing expectations, I think at the time, in terms of the timescales, it was very challenging in terms of we just didn't know how many people would sign up because of the initial deadlines. It became a little bit haphazard. It wasn't always as logical, and I think from our perspective, the more time, if we'd had more time, got signs up in clusters, in rows, it would have been a lot easier for the contractor and for them to organise the work. So in an ideal world, that would be having enough time to be able to do that would be really good. We generally found that residents, we had to explain to people, so the council employed a dedicated project officer who basically was that conduit between the residents and the contractor, did all the signing up, and basically we did lots of explanations, photos, explaining. And it's, we have to be clear that some of the residents found the work quite traumatic, and certainly once insulation was on the wall, it at times got quite difficult, but we were able to talk people through and explain, and I think ultimately people are then glad that they've had that work done. We underestimated the number of empty properties that there were on that a small estate of 96 properties, and we really struggled. We got one who actually lived in Australia, and we were still able to get everything sorted, and they were happy to engage, and they actually made a contribution which was really positive. Our experience was that private landlords were very different. Some were absolutely brilliant. Word couldn't do any, they couldn't do enough because they could see that their tenants were going to benefit, and they really saw that they were prepared to make the contributions and that were required. But equally, there were a small number that only engaged once they saw how, shall I say, how they're shabby, perhaps externally, their property, and how it stood out. Then at that some point, we had quite a few late referrals and people wanting to get that work done. So from our perspective, we didn't just, it's a quite a quick decision in terms of making to choose this area, but it was also, we very much did, we worked with the contractor that we had on board. We acted quickly once we could see what was with the opportunities that were going to come. We got a contractor in that we really were happy to work with, and we were really pleased with the way, but we very much chose it with them, knowing that they were confident that they could deliver. From our perspective, this area, I thought that most councils would take this approach in terms of you take a cluster, take an area, and try and offer it to everybody, across all 10 years. But I think that's clearly not been the case. We found it's worked. And I think that area-based approach, and particularly having the social landlord that says, yes, it's going to happen, it really helps generate leads. But I think we also need to be cautious about and have a strategy around the people that perhaps ask for it because they fear of missing out but aren't fully sure what they're actually signing up for. So we want to be really, really sort of careful about how we then going forward, how we engage and make sure that people are really clear about what they want to do. I think one of the most important things we did is that I got approval for that we would effectively pay the full cost of the work, and that we, if needed, landlords would set up a payment plan to then to repay the council in terms of any balance. That worked really well. We've had no problems, and that's worked for landlord. And on the whole, landlord were really pleased with that, because for some of them that perhaps owe 2 or 3 properties, to be able to find the capital in one go would be too much. One of the things that for us, it was that first introduction about installers and how they get paid, and the sort of some of the complications, and how perhaps a contractor might lead in terms of the sorts of work that the sort of properties that they want to do. We'd got no idea. We were very naive at that stage, but it's certainly, I think, an important consideration. Although the properties were quite small and relatively inexpensive, they weren't great for the renderers because they were quite bitty, and there was a lot of cutting out to do. So from an efficiency perspective, it did have an impact on them. We engaged very early with our planners. We understood in terms of that it was the right place. Amber Valley has lots of conservation areas. It's got a World Heritage Corridor, so there are lots of areas where it wouldn't go down very well with our planning colleagues if we started to put lots of external wall insulation on the wall. So we very much we sort of engaged with them. They were very happy. We talked to them about colours of the and chose and offered a colour palette that the planners were then happy with. We actually put a single planning application in for the whole estate, because at the outset we didn't know who would be signing up. It caused 1 or 2 problems in terms of people that absolutely didn't want it, but it was actually a lot easier to then deal with that way, because there were some doubts. I think there was something like 16 properties out of the 96 that had retained the brick. The rest had got some form of rendering. One of the challenges was around, again, the challenges I think for doing area-based work is obviously the contractors need a base. Futures as the landlord were really helpful, but clearly, and there were some tensions around that some of the location of that base did take some of the parking away, and unfortunately 1 or 2 of the people that were most affected were actually people that they didn't get the work done. So they perhaps, shall we say, stirred a little bit. But that's just something one needs to be prepared to deal with, and again, communication. And it was interesting. That was again our first approach of social media in terms of it by doing work in an area. It's one incident can soon spark off, and it's again being able to manage that and being aware of how you respond. So our second base project, which is one I think we're really, really proud of, we took the lessons learned from Ironville. We worked very carefully on to select an area. We sat down with the contractors, Westville, and we looked for that combination of house types that would lend themselves to the work. And we chose, it was a Fletcher in Ripley. There were 101 homes, probably have 3 or 4 versions of a similar archetype. They needed to have roofline extensions, But it was really successful. So our aim was to insulate, again, majority, something like 40 were social housing. The majority, apart from 2, were owner occupied. I think there were 2 private rented, and in the end we were able to do 93 out of 101, which I think we're really pleased. And we know that lots of people have been to see that project, and I think that's, and again, it has won a couple of awards, which we were really pleased about. So it was very much selected in collaboration with the contractor and other interested parties. It was very much focused on the sort of the idea of the win-win-win, in terms of, we want to be able to help as many people. The contract, and obviously if the contractor is happy and they're the right sort of properties, then that really worked. We had some engagement with our local politicians, and they were very supported. From the outset, it wasn't necessarily seen as a regeneration project. I don't think the area was that bad, but actually when it turned out, the outcome has been, because we had such a high impact and such a high uptake, it's almost been seen as a regeneration project. It's been really, really positive. So I think and we know that it's just given the whole area a lift in terms of people looking at the social land reports, that people are looking after their property more. It's just given a real sort of positive vibe for that area. And I think the important thing for me, and I perhaps saw this from what didn't work for other councils, is that area approach works for the contractor. It makes welfare arrangements. We have to acknowledge that our social housing provider had some land nearby. They were happy to allocate to give them a base, and that was really, really important in terms of having that infrastructure. So our choice was, unfortunately, the private landlords in Nineville did mess us around quite a lot. So we did consciously choose an area. We did consciously choose an area that had fewer private landlord properties. I think it's important. We saw it very much as a partnership. We did not try and micromanage. We understood the value of where our input was. We very much focused on that sign up, that confidence, giving doing enough verification and validation of the work that was being done, and effectively dealing with any queries. We found dealing with owner occupiers quite fine. I think the industry perhaps sometimes needs to think that there's a risk that almost there's a difference between owner occupiers and private tenants, and therefore the job. It shouldn't. I think sometimes that there is perhaps a perception that think people are different and they need treating differently, and I don't think they should. From our perspective, delivering the scheme that we're talking about was complicated. It effectively transcended 1B phases 2, phases 3, and even Hug 1. So there was we were quite flexible in our approach, in the sense of we tried to optimize and make the most of working within the grant funding rules and averages, and it was and obviously things that got extended, so properties that we thought would be in one phase had to be moved across. Didn't make any difference from the client's perspective and the recipient, but ultimately perhaps there were some challenges in there, but I think we managed that quite well, and we're able, with the support of the Midlands Net Zero Hub as well, able to really deliver a good positive project. So from our perspective, one of the things that we did do, and I think probably part of the reason we worked with the contractor and Futures to write it up, to learn the lessons, because we just thought what we were doing was was normal and everybody would be doing the same thing, but clearly it wasn't. And I think that partnership, the value of that partnership was really, really important in terms of just trusting each other and but being supportive of where we needed to be supportive. We, as a council, we kept close control of the budget. We were prepared to take some risks around averages, knowing that we had to do other work to be able to maintain that overall project and to come within the spending caps, and it was challenging. sometimes things do go wrong. And so one of the major challenges for us was that what nobody had really picked up at the outset was that the electricity supply on a lot of these houses was done through this aerial system, where basically the power would come to one house and then there would be feeds that would then go from 3 or 4 other houses. Now, our contractor had worked in other areas where this was the case, and they had got quite a good local relationship with the electricity infrastructure provider, but it was quite challenging in terms of we actually found that they were really incredibly busy in our area doing lots of sort of EV installs, and they weren't able to respond quite as quickly as perhaps we thought we would. And inevitably it was quite complicated because the electric had to be made safe before the scaffolding went up, then the scaffolding had to go up. So there were sort of multiple interactions where, and of course we had to bear in mind if there were any critical households with dialysis or other where there were risks around their electricity supply. We did have, so from our perspective, in terms of our choice, we had lots of data, we had lots of knowledge. So it was a combination of experienced officers that kind of knew where that we would go, but we also had some quite robust data around house types, EPC data, that then really helped us, and income data that helped us be confident that choosing this area would work. As I said, we were flexible, we were prepared for bumps, and especially dealing with owner occupiers. Some of them were quite demanding, yeah, we needed quite a lot of support, but that's fine. And I also think, it's being realistic that actually maintaining working relationships on larger projects like this, it takes a lot of time, and it's having that confidence going to keep going even when there are those bumps along the road. And and I think importantly, it's how you respond to those bumps that is the important thing. And ultimately it's trying to get to that win-win situation where the contractor's done as much as work as possible, the occupier or the owner of the home they're benefiting, and that's that ultimate outcome we're going for. Interestingly, in terms of some of the things that their residents, they had no interest. We talked about to them about sort of the outcomes. That it was all about energy bills. They had absolutely no interest in carbon savings. It meant nothing to them at all. We would love to go back and perhaps evaluate more effectively in terms of what the impact had on people. We know that anecdotally there's some real positive that people have had to put the heating on later in the October. But I think for us it would be nice to do some more of that work. And I think it's a huge, for us, it's certainly in Amber Valley, it's a huge challenge. These were nice, straightforward properties to do, but so many of, even then, there was a couple of properties where we got work done, but we couldn't do everything and we had to fund that separately, because they'd got conservatories and other additions to the house that made it at that time, in terms of past standards, made it really difficult to deliver. One of the, I suppose, a warning sign, one of the things that we'd had no idea about was that whilst we were actually having work done and people had signed up for things like boiler replacements and other work, we actually had other eco-funded contractors do it, almost taking work that we'd already promised to pay for and getting things done. That was a bit of a shock to us. It felt wrong. I feel there's probably not much we can do about it, but we actually had we were finding that as the guys were finishing off their insulation, there were other contractors coming along drilling holes in their beautiful new render and insulation for boiler flues, and that it felt wrong. But ultimately, I think this is the danger in terms of the occupiers. They didn't know that wasn't part of the scheme, or it was really unfortunate. But from our perspective, we managed to deal with it, and there's the work was still signed off, and the project generally there's so much interest, lots of people, and I think lots of people came to see it. I think even some of our and our current ministers were invited to come and see and have seen some of the work that was done there. From our perspective, in terms of it gave the whole area, it wasn't just about energy efficiency and insulation, it really was very much about giving that area a lift. We would love just to do a little bit more work just to sort of see what else has happened as a result. I think from our perspective, I thought, as I said before, I thought from the very outset that this would be the best way of delivering, your installation programs, taking an area to the, but the work we did with our social housing provider was critical. They were really helpful, really engaged. They've actually cemented a really closer working relationship, which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute. We also, so just to actually, there was a question about funding. So I also manage the Better Care Fund, and we kind of we thought just in case we might need it, so we did make some provision within our housing renewal policy that if there were people that would benefit from of this type of work, that we had the permission to be able to use it. So we did have a small number of people that we used Better Care Fund allocations to, just to provide some additional support for people. But we did that, and we at the very outset, without going into big details, we flagged up something like a third of the residents that we're doing this work for had some sort of health condition that would be impacted by the cold. So again, that sort of legitimized the sort of selection of this area. So in terms of where we go next, we delivered, with the same contractor, we delivered 3 sort of smaller clusters of mixed tenure schemes in other parts of the borough. One was an area that was known, there's a row of houses, around 25 houses, I believe, that were very exposed and historically had always been really hard to keep warm. So we chose those as properties to do, and that was really successful. And then the next phase, we kind of turned to a circle. So our local social housing provider, through their social housing decarbonization fund, they had a list. They had about 100 plus properties that they were then doing, but we identified that actually alongside that, there were obviously neighbouring properties and company properties that also were doing. So what we effectively did was we used our LAD 3 funding to then enable them to sign up eligible households to be able to then, so as Sustainable could do the work at the same time, and effectively delivering alongside. So it was almost role reversed. So, and we then would pay the bill directly to Sustainable. So again, that worked really well, and has helped. And certainly helped with some of the houses that were, depending on the archetype, where you needed to do both to make them pass compliant. So that was really, really helpful. Unfortunately, from our perspective, Hug 2 didn't really work for us. We do have some off gas, but we weren't able to apply that same sort of methodology to doing area-based work. So we're looking forward very much to sort of being able to deliver warm homes. So we're compiling we're sort of looking at trying to replicate our model, where we want to go next. We know that we've got something like 6,000 homes in the borough that are IMD 1 and 2. We've actually got a waiting list in terms of people already that are keen to have this work done, building on those existing schemes. We're also wanting to look at how we can move to targeting particularly empty homes, particularly for doing more and more internal work, because certainly there's an awful lot of properties that I believe that from a planning perspective and probably a common sense perspective, they need internal wall insulation, not external wall insulation. And of course, for me, that is best done when the property is empty. And we're also looking at obviously using the sort of the increased opportunities for private landlords to make sure that those ultimately that we can get as many of those properties done as possible as well, for the benefit of the tenant and the future tenant. So yeah, so we're very much looking forward. We want a sustainable delivery model. I think the key for us is about the planning and the time. It was very hard work and it was very hiring. I think we've done amazingly well for a bit of my time and a project officer with a spend of over £5 million over those 3 years. But I think we need a little bit more time to plan and to get things done. And I think it was down to the fact we had a really good contractor, really good partnership arrangements that really made that work and made it a real success. And thank you. Any questions?